So, have a couple of different topics to kind of cover in somewhat random order here, but we've been making really good progress. So I think we're in pretty good shape as far as being set up for the apple tree, kaboom, et cetera, project. I'm going to show you a couple of different versions I've done in the past and talk about what the differences were and kind of what some of the subtleties were, where I added quote unquote juiciness and whatnot. And also reminder, next week there's no official synchronous class time, so we're not going to be here in person or officially during this time slot. I'm going to be out of state. But I will be accessible through Discord, just kind of not normal time. So if you have any project questions, it's basically you have a week to work on your project, catch up on things, kind of get things done, and we'll work it that way. So we're in good shape though. I think as far as almost not quite halfway into the semester, and we're about certainly halfway through the materials. So we're good. So one of the things in talking about the project and seeing in any of the descriptions of the requirements, there's mention of high score and keeping a high score and having a persistent high score. I may have alluded to this. I'm not sure. I couldn't find it exactly in my lecture notes because I kind of divided things up a little bit, but I wanted to pull it out again. Did I talk about player prefs at all specifically? Don't think I did. I want to make sure. So how to save the high score or potentially save any kind of player preferences in your game. I'm sure you've played some kind of game where it was like, okay, you set the resolution of the monitor, or you told it your name, or which speaker system to use, or audio outputs, what mode to run the game in, that sort of thing, and it would persist. So you didn't have to set it every time you came into the game, or a simple kind of thing like imagine an arcade game where you have a high score. So you beat the high score somewhere. Unbeknownst to you, it saves that high score, and the next time the game is played, the high score is still there, because it wouldn't be any fun if it never remembered the high score, because that wouldn't really be much of a high score after all. So Unity has a specific system set up for storing player preferences or player prefs, and it's meant to store just simple stuff. It's not going to store the whole state of everything in the game. You could have it store, if you want to say, well, what level you're on, and it was the index of a level, just one number for it, great. Complex structures and so on, it's not about that. It's like saving an integer, a Boolean, simple things like that. A floating point number, just kind of single data structures like that. No, nothing like a real structure or a class. You wouldn't do that. There are other systems, other ways to do that, which is really kind of beyond the intro to game programming piece of it. There's lots and lots of ways to serialize data. Now, we've referred to serialization of data a little bit before in some of the things in the Unity editor, or sometimes in our scripts we would say serializable field or serialized field, which would mean that when those things are edited in the Unity editor, they get saved as part of the project. But this is different, right? This is actually saved during gameplay, right? So we can have things change in the game, and somewhere in the Unity preferences they get saved. So ideal for high score, right? So player prefs used to store and access simple data across play sessions, provides quick and convenient way to serialize limited types of data. Not to be used for the entire game state or anything like that necessarily. I mean, you could, like I said, what level the player's on, or a certain stage or something like that, probably good enough. I wouldn't do it to like every location, every boss that's been beaten, or exactly where the number of objects on the screen or something like that. Probably not a great idea. So it's sort of a you can imagine it kind of being kind of dictionary-ish. So using player preferences works by using a string as a key, similar as you would in a dictionary-type data structure, that winds up being bound to a particular piece of information that allows you to then later retrieve it. For example, you might set a key called high score to save the top score as an integer, and then you can retrieve later using the key high score again. Right. You don't need to specify a particular namespace, so it's there kind of by default for you. No extra using statement needed. But it does belong to this static class player prefs. So you would say, to use it, you say like player prefs dot delete key, player prefs dot has key, player prefs dot set float, and so on and so on. Right? Common methods that you'll be using: you can delete a key. You can check whether or not a key already exists, or the real meat and potatoes of it is setting those, creating a key and setting a value that belongs to that. So, for instance, you might say high score or player prefs dot set int high score and then the number you're going to save. And then, similarly, to retrieve it, you just have a get version. Right? So set the given key to hold the given value. And the nice thing is if the key does not already exist, it creates it. Otherwise, whatever is already there, it overwrites. And in the case of getting or retrieving a value, if it doesn't exist, you can have it have a default value present. So you could say, well, for example, get the high score. And if there is no high score, you might have said, oh, okay, default value is 100, so the high score is always at least 100, even if it doesn't exist. So you don't have to set it ahead of time. You can really just use set and get and kind of forget it, if you like. So here's a bit of simple code. Now, typically, you have to have somewhere during the startup of the game where you get the high score value. And here's a little bit of an over-specified, to the kind of the explicit way here, checking first to see if a key exists. So for example, here during the start of the game, maybe it's on the start of the game manager object, or could be even like every time if a player joins the game. So if you had something where a new player joins, you have to check it there. So it may or may not be the start of an object. Might be in response to some kind of other action, but typically it'd be in the start routine of, or the start method of, say, the game manager. Would say, if not player prefs has key high score, so if it doesn't already exist, you could say, well, okay, I'm going to then set an int for high score to default high score. So that would be, again, worrying about explicitly setting it, making sure it currently exists before getting the value for it if you wanted to. Then high score equals player prefs dot get int using the name or the key high score, and that would become your high score that you then show on the screen. Maybe you have a system where you just have some text on the screen that says, okay, here's the current score over high score, or maybe you have two different text fields, or however you want to show it on the screen. You can do that. Then later on, one way of keeping track of the high score, at some point you have to save it. You could save it every time the player exceeds the high score, so it could just be built into the scoring function. Might be a little inefficient if you're constantly changing the high score, because you only want to change it when the game ends. It's nice if you did have it change it continuously. If the game crashed or if the game exited or something like that, you wouldn't have to clean up after yourself and just automatically set it. But in general cases, you probably just want to say, well, the game is over, or they're quitting, or they hit a certain milestone, and at that point, you check, okay, the current score, did it exceed the high score? Go ahead, set int, write it out. So next time in, it gets back again. Right? Pretty simple. Makes the game that much more fun going into the game. Right? So that's it for player prefs, really. It's that easy. So wanted to show a couple of different versions now of the Kaboom game, or the apple tree game, with some variations on the theme. What am I doing here? There. What have I? He's gone. It's one of those cases where suddenly all the window menus, or the title bars, all blended into one another. I got disoriented. All right, so first, this was our version from, no, that's not our version from the other day. I don't have the version from the other day just yet, so let's put this up. So this is one version. Let's see, let me make it maximize on play here. Yeah. So you'll see there are 3 baskets, and I can catch the apples as they fall. And there actually is even a pause feature. There's a little button on the canvas there that the moment I press that button, what it does is it sets the time scale to 0. And what that means is it tells basically the physics engine to just stop and no time passes. So delta time then becomes 0. So no physics movement or anything that's based on any timing going on. I can still move my mouse around and still get my basket to move around because they're not based on time. So I can unpause the game. It's a little bit awkward because with my mouse and my baskets moving, I may have gotten out of the way. So typical gameplay here. I'm just going to maybe miss. All right, lose a basket. I want to get a bunch of apples on the screen at once. Whoops. It's tough looking back here. So I exceeded the high score, and I got one of my baskets back. Let it get real crazy here. Or actually, I guess every 25, I think I get another one. Okay, so you see, when I miss one, all the apples, even the higher ones, disappear. And eventually, I lose, I go back to another scene, I've got some different music going on. And I'm even referring back, and in this scene, you can always then refer back to the high score and use it other places in the game. So maybe in the start screen you say, okay, here's what the current high score is. So in my menu here, I even have a little bit of things to change the music and so on. Or not change, but change the volume. And if I click there, you also notice the music continued through here. Now I'm using a don't destroy on load and using a singleton to keep the audio playing throughout. And let's see. This pausing doesn't pause the audio. So let's and I can quit and end the game entirely. So that was one version. That one's kind of the normal, quote unquote, normal version. It had the high score. Now if I go back into the game, you should see the high score is still 66, right? So it's there even though I quit the game and came back in again. Right? So that's one version, pretty vanilla. And then another version that got a little bit more carried away was the sort of became a Halloween-themed version. And I think there's a setup screen for this too. So let me go to the setup screen first. Where is that? Scarecrow info. No, that's not. Okay. So this had, it said gain a life if you get the bucket, lose a life if you catch a pitchfork. If you get a bag, gain points for catching, lose life on miss, and there are rocks that if you catch a rock, it doesn't do anything. And actually, let me go and make this also maximize on play. All right. So the volume is way down. So added some additional fun things where if you lose a life, you also have this kind of animation of the scarecrow to taunt you. You'll also notice when I lose a life here, it's kind of subtle, but if I lose a life, it doesn't immediately start dropping new stuff either, right? There's a pause, which kind of makes it sort of bearable. And here, instead of switching to another scene, I just have a you died sort of thing, and the player is replaced by this tombstone kind of thing, and attract mode, I guess, of the game. It'll keep running forever, though. So you can get fancier with regards to how things are handled. Notice in here, all the typical mechanics are still maintained in that, if I miss an item, all of the items in that list got destroyed. I was able to kind of keep with the main themes. But still be, enough of a variation. I mean, how many different variations of, simple themes are there in so many other games as well? So one of the other things I wanted to demonstrate actually is in this other version not that version. Where is it? Oh, no. That one. Okay. So I talked about how I kind of recommended that the baskets be something that the player instantiates and that the player holds onto, right? So they're a distinct object. How you doing? Just dropping stuff off? Yeah. No problem. So to talk about, specifically having the player object in the game be the thing that controls the motion, and then Hello? Sorry, kind of hearing you over the speakers. Okay. So we have the player object here, which has a script and the main audio sources on it. So this one decided to have, I think that it would be the player that would be the one responsible for the squish sound or the swish sound or the success, which is our high score or get a new basket sort of sound. So those would be audio sources on the player object. But the baskets themselves, it starts off, in this case, there are no baskets just yet on the scene as things start out, but there are a reference to the prefab that's going to be for the basket and the initial number of baskets to start with. So I could do, say, well, I want to have maybe 4 baskets when the game starts, right? So a little bit of configuration possibility. And the other interesting thing that I implemented here is kind of a fun, weird version. The default state is If there are no baskets, it has to decide, kind of put them in order, create them, instantiate them, start at the bottom, work its way up. So a simple loop, 0, then 1, then 2, and so on. Or you could put baskets into the scene, if I can remember where the prefabs are, and just sort of locate them throughout the scene. And the game would be sort of smart enough to say, well, I'm going to use the ones that you've placed in the scene, and then, in this case, it added one more because I only placed 3, and I'd asked for 4 baskets. And it's kind of interesting now because I can catch them wherever. I think we talked about another, say, potential variation in your game where you might have a certain type of basket that needs to catch a certain type of item, or vice versa, and you can get much more interesting with the logic of what particular baskets are doing what. So this one, I'd like to show you how I went through the baskets, how I created them. You'll notice it starts off, I didn't even make these. These baskets are just positioned in the scene anywhere. But then the moment I press play, I'll pause again, and you'll see that the player has gathered up those baskets and put it underneath, right, made it part of its hierarchy. Right. So let's look at the script that does that. So we have one player script which controls the player's motion in this game. And in this particular one, let's see. I'm trying to think, does it keep track of score in here? It must have a different object for keeping track of score. So the interesting part with regards to making, setting that initial state, gathering up the baskets, having them belong to the player, is in here. You'll see it has an array of game objects called baskets that it's going to use just locally here, right? This is part of the start method, so any object that's declared in the scope is going to be just temporary for now, but it has an important job to do up here in that the first thing that happens during startup is I find game objects with that are tagged basket, right? So my prefab, and I could even put other items in there and find anything with that tag. Right? We talked about the usefulness of the tag feature there. It'll get back an array containing all of the things that it found in the scene that had that tag set. So I would fill in this baskets array just with that one call, right? And then what I do, let's see if I did this in here, referring back to some older stuff. I think this is used elsewhere. Don't worry about corner. Don't worry about that. So here is where I normally would build where the baskets were in the scene, where I'd place them. So what I do here is I look to see, well, I want to create however many baskets I set in the Unity editor, so 0 to whatever number. And there are two possibilities. There's the possibility that the basket already exists because I allowed myself or some other designer that I worked with to place them in the scene, in which case I would grab that basket out of that array and add that basket as or set the parent of that basket to be the player, right? So that's how I kind of collected the baskets up underneath the player. And if I find that a basket doesn't exist, or I need to create more than the number of baskets that I found, which if there were none, I'd create 3, et cetera, et cetera. In that case, what I do is I instantiate them from scratch, right? So I have an offset that tells me how to position them with regards to one another. They're basically offset by 0.5, right? So half a unit up That's why they kind of are so tightly packed there. So I have an offset. I instantiate the basket prefab, offset by that, and also wind up making anything I create a child of the player as well, right? So either case. In the end here, I also add it to a list of baskets. So here, I'm demonstrating both arrays and lists in the same version here. So I'm using this list of baskets to keep track of the global number of baskets that I have so I can turn them on and off and destroy them and so on. But I'm using an array just kind of locally here to kind of sneak in some array usage here. Another way to do it. And the way that I manage baskets being won or lost is if I lose a life, I wind up destroying the 0th basket from the list, or the last basket to be, is it the last basket to be added? Yeah. The one at the end of the list. So 0th wouldn't be, it's kind of a weird, I might have changed that. So it's basically the last basket to be added is the one that gets destroyed, right? And then anytime I need to, well, I always check if there's no baskets left after I destroyed a basket, I can tell it game over. Now, if I need to add a basket back in because I got 25 points, right? I said every time I get 25 points, I can get another basket. That happened to be the logic in this particular version of the game. I would say, all right, if my score exceeded or got to be a multiple of 25, and I have fewer than 4 baskets, I said a maximum number of baskets, I would play my victory sound, and then I would add a basket according to that offset that the same type of offset. So it's not going to maintain the position of them and if the wacky version, that unfortunately, it's going to just kind of do the simple thing and create another basket just like I created them at the beginning of the game, right? So this is one way to potentially manage the baskets and destroying them and getting them back for a score and so on, a score of 25 or whatever. So this is kind of an interesting thing I hadn't counted on talking about, but can mention it here. You'll notice that it's referring to the game objects, the components on the current game object, which is the player in this case. So I have the swish sound. I happen to know that's going to be at offset 1 or index 1, and I have the win sound or the trumpet fanfare. That's the second index. All right, so I can use get components here. Get components returns an array of these components, and then I can just index whichever one I want to use. So here was, make sure I look at the right one. Yeah. 0 is the first audio source, which is my swish sound. 1 is my, oh, is it swish? Squish, sorry. So 0 is squish, 1 is swish, and 2 is success. So in my script, I can refer to each of those to play different sounds depending on what's going on with the player. So you'll notice the spawning sound wasn't here because, well, the spawning sound, I felt that should belong to the actual apples as they come into existence. So that might not even need to be scripted. Like you'll notice in, I think, hopefully an Apple script here. an apple will come into existence, and really all it needs to do, this was some extra test I should take out. The main thing that the apple coming into existence would do is it add itself to a list of apples, and then if it collides with the basket, in here, that's how it decided that the apple colliding with the basket would remove the apple, tell the basket, call the hit basket function of the player, and destroy itself. So it'd remove it from its list and destroy itself. And so let's see. Here we start to see things like, okay, if I need to call a method of another script, right? So the player script here is PS. And where did that come from? That came from here, where I said, all right, here's a stored reference to the player script, which I happen to set up in the start routine of this class. All right? So what's going on here, oh boy, this is, I guess, an optimization. We're mostly veterans here, so what's going on, you'll notice here, it's checking an instance. So you might think to yourself, well, that's a little bit like what we did with singletons, right? Right? You wanted to check, did something already exist? And if it already exists, it's playing that game of musical chairs. Say, okay, someone's already in the chair. I should destroy myself. I don't need to be around, right? In the case of the singleton, you can only have one of them. Now, in this case, what is happening is that the apples have certain collective behavior, right? They may share a reference to the player script. There's no reason for each of them to have each instance to have its own reference to that script, right? They all would refer to what else? Let's see, the player script. Also some location on the screen, because I guess they're going to use that. I might be figuring that if it falls off, this version was destroying itself if it fell off the bottom of the screen. Right? So here's this version said, if you exceed a certain value, then you need to cost the player a life and so on. So in something similar to the singleton, it would have certain things that would only be set up if no one else has already set them up. Right? So this way, it wouldn't go through all of this, which might involve finding the player or going through the list or going, you don't need to do it every time you instantiated the apple. You just need to do it once for all of the apples. Right? So it'd say, okay, during startup, if no one else has bothered to set this up, instance is null, it would say, well, okay, I'm the first one, so therefore I can set myself here, and then set these things that would be static to the whole class. You'll see they are static. The corner, the list of apples is static. The instance reference itself is static. And even the reference to the player object and the player object script, that's all static and done just once. Right? So that's what's happening here. Then the things that would happen after that, this is some experimenting I was doing. Say, if you're trying to figure out, okay, am I an instance of an object that was created based on instantiation, or am I an instance of an object that was placed in a scene? You might want to know that because maybe you want to if someone left a prefab in a scene, that you want to destroy all the things that should have been just used as prefabs. What I did here, I'm not sure what I was playing with was say, okay, if the name does not contain clone, because all prefabs, when they're instantiated, their name contains clone. So I just had it kind of keeping track and warning me that I had left a non-dynamic prefab in my scene for one reason or another. I don't know why I did that, but it's there, so I figured I should explain it. All right. And the logic for, like I said, for this particular instance, I said, well, all right, I'm going to do it so that if it exceeds the boundary at the bottom of the screen, then, let's see, we calculate that boundary first off. It's kind of a fun one. There's not a hard-coded boundary. Instead, it says screen to world point 000, which is going to give me the corner of the world that I can use, the corner of the screen with regards to the world, and refer to that when it comes to figuring out, did I cross that line? That's what I did here. Say, okay, does the transform's position exceed the corner? And if it does, it's time to destroy all the apples in the list and tell the player script, invoke the player script, and tell it to lose, that you lost a life. So over in the player script is this public method that I could say, player script lost life. That's how I can reference that. And in there, that's where it's saying, all right, play that squish sound, the bad sound, and as long as there are baskets to destroy, go ahead and destroy them. And if I've destroyed them all, then call my game manager game over method. Right. So here we have now game manager, and the game manager takes care of doing things like returning to the loading scene, the pause, the showing of scores, and I guess in here, for some reason or another, I decided that the current score would be kept track of by the game manager. This is a one-player only game. The game manager is who would keep track of the score, and I think also would do the testing to see, okay, did we exceed the high score? If so, show that. And then ultimately, I think when it exited, game over, it would set the high score when the game ended. Right. So the game manager here took care of all that other stuff. Oh, and you could also do look for the key P instead of just pressing that other pause. A little easier than moving the mouse around and pressing it. So that's one way of doing the game. A little bit more, opens up some options. Like I said, in terms of, I could give these scripts or even give this Unity session, Unity project to someone else, and they could design levels to the game. Decide, okay, this is the layout of the baskets in this stage, and so on and so on. Do that sort of thing. Possibility. Any questions? No? All right. Let's see. So that's that one. And let's look at the scarecrow one. So the important scene in Scarecrow this one here. So you'll see everything in the scene for starters, but the moment I press play, It will hide certain things like you're dead, you died, hit space to restart. So this one, things are more taken care of by the player script itself. So the player controller actually has the score inside of it. Another way to approach it. And in this one, the buckets are kept track of in an array instead of kept track in a list. And the setup for the buckets is kind of a lot simpler in that really all it does is during its startup, it says, okay, find all the game objects with tag basket, puts that into its bucket array, and that's the array that it just uses. Right? It doesn't actually set up anything. It counts on the buckets already being part of the player there. Now, the interesting thing that this does instead, now it says, well, okay, since it's just in an array and I'm not instantiating buckets, I'm just kind of using them. So instead of destroying them and recreating them here, it takes another method. It says, okay, well, what we're going to do is actually just make buckets active and inactive. Another approach. Right? So you can destroy objects, recreate objects, or we can just, we have some number, 3, that are just always going to be in the scene, but are going to be active or inactive. So losing a bucket is, in this case, as simple as saying whatever the last bucket that we encountered was, or the last one in the array, that one, its active attribute gets set to false, and we continue on. Right? So much simpler. Right? I think during, let's see, the thing to watch out for is that inactive objects in your scene, when you call this, when you find game objects with tag basket, if they're inactive, it probably won't find them here. So things have to be active at the start of the scene for things to find it. So you sort of have to set everything, then it'll go through and just inactivate them when they disappear. And it does have you gain them back. You get, you can get for a high score, for gain bucket, it would then just say, well, okay, some situation has been met to say, okay, let's give the bucket back, give the player back another bucket. As long as they have less than 3 buckets currently, we can say, all right, the next bucket in the bucket array, we'll just turn it to be active again. Right? So this is the way we don't instantiate and destroy and so on. Instead, we just have a fixed array that we set objects to active and inactive in. Different approach. Which one's right? Which one's wrong? Well, in the end, if it plays right and that's takes me through to the end of the game how I wanted to, then I guess that works. All right. What other things? This one has a slightly different approach to the high score. Right? The scoring is kept track of here in the player, and it uses the get and set methods of the score. So if anyone refers to player.score, which can be accessed publicly here, so if anyone says player.score plus plus, the get and set will be invoked, and get and set will check it will actually write the text, the score text to the screen, and it will check it against the high score and directly, if it needs to, it will write it here. In our game, there's not so much going on that there's not suddenly a terrible drag inefficiency that we do this every time the score changes. It's okay. Depends what you need it to do. So there's another version where instead of at the end of the game, it does it every time the high score is exceeded. It decides to go and say, all right, set that in right there. And it writes that to the separate high score text component on the screen. In retrospect, I would definitely not want to do this. Got to go back and rewrite that. Doing a find every time the score changed, that is definitely inefficient because it is going through that whole potential list of game objects. So that one I should probably go back and change, and somewhere in start, find a reference to the high score object and just refer to that, or even get a reference to this whole component so I'm not referencing that component every time, right? Does everyone understand what I mean by that? Right. So leave some bad code so we can discuss ways to fix it. All right. And similarly, in here, things got a little bit more interesting with regards to multiple different types of items. Some things you want to catch, some things you don't want to catch. How do you manage all that? Well, they're all managed in this same dropped item class, right? Dropped item component, so that any time you drop an item or an item is dropped, it's added to this class. But certain things about them, let's see, let's look at the prefabs here to remind myself how this one is particularly done. So if we look in these, so you'll see there are scripts. This is just a dropped item. This one is a bag behavior. Let's see what that looks like. Now, this we'll introduce for now and really start talking about it as we get into the context of, we start talking about inheritance and object-oriented programming. So here, the way I've added additional types of items is that there's one sort of base generic dropped item thing, like the rock. The rock drops. All it has to do is drop. It doesn't have to add a score. It doesn't really do anything. It collides. It's just going to disappear. Has some kind of base behavior to it. However, in the case of a bag, we're going to base that. We're going to we're going to inherit from the dropped item. That's what's going on here. Saying we're creating this new class called bag behavior, but it's based on or inheriting from this other class called dropped item. So it has certain things that it's going to do. It's going to have a different start here than the typical dropped item. And in the case of each of them, you'll see. Let's see, that was the bag, and the bonus bucket, for example, it has something else that it does, but it's also based on that dropped item. And last but not least, why it's called the tombstone. It's actually the pitchfork, but I think originally I had them dropping tombstones And it has its own, the tombstone based on the dropped item that has some differences to it. So possibilities, for those of you who are doing advanced stuff, I'm assuming maybe you know more about, inheritance and so on. So maybe you want to think about, doing things like that, organizing things. You're probably wondering what add listener and all that is, and that's yet another thing that's more advanced than normally we talk about. That's really a project 3 thing, ahead of myself on here as well. Okay, so we'll probably wind up finishing up early today, and I just want to make sure that our bases are covered and there are no questions on the project. So this one was actually cut into different parts. We talked about the scene management piece of things. We've talked about the singleton and audio across scene loads thing. We have now talked about player preferences. We've done things with random, right? We've talked about random. And we've talked about static items, where our static things are generally shared across instances, or shared across having like a static class like our math library or our player prefs library. It's kind of one that everybody can refer to. It's both public and persistent. We had that. We talked about invoke and invoke repeating, their use. Oh, we had talked about, was there a danger in kind of using invoke in a recursive way? I think it was you that asked that question. And it really, if you look at how it runs, we really don't have that issue. In a normal, the question, I don't have a slide for it, so I'll have to maybe write on the board. In classic and a real recursive function, say we have my func here, and it does stuff, and ultimately at the end it will call my func again at the end here, right? So this func will call here, it calls itself and keeps going on and on and on. You have other code here, right? How far down, the issue is you never get past here, right? You never actually get past. But in the case of invoke, you always get past, right? This actually, the job of invoking, it winds up pushing to another, I don't know if it's another thread specifically, but it actually gets past there, so it doesn't accumulate on the stack like you might worried about. So it's pseudo-recursive when we use invoke in there, because the code does fall through. It just sets that up to happen somewhere else. So anyway. We have that covered. All right. We've talked certainly a lot about finding game objects by name, getting components. Some of the other things we might get fancier with when you're trying to traverse a tree, find certain components, or find, if you have some complex object, which might be a ship or a thing that might have children that are launchers or weapons or whatever they might be. Imagine these kind of elaborate hierarchies of objects that you might want to find out whether the children of a certain object within that hierarchy, if they have components of certain types. So you can actually traverse up and down using things like get component in children Right? So find any child of this object that has an animator or a collider or something like that. You do that sort of things. You can also be careful and say try get component, so that you can say, well, does this have one of these components, right? So that you don't wind up accidentally referring to a component that doesn't exist, right? So you can be careful about certain things where once you start asking, if you are assuming always like get a component and call it, or get a component and use something, set the text field or something, you always run that risk of accidentally dereferencing some kind of null reference. So there are ways such as try get component and so on to kind of set a value conditionally, or if you're not sure if an object exists. You can also do things like require components and stuff. It gets fancier and so on. So we'll go a little through the project. Kaboom with apples, aka score points by catching stuff dropped by a random moving antagonist before they hit the ground. Basic idea: enemy moves left to right across the top of the screen. Use one of the methods we've discussed. The enemy drops apples at random, and the random in this case, how random it is, or it either has to be random or at some increasing interval. So your option on that one. Enemy changes direction if it hits the edge of the screen playfield. You can hard code it. You could look for Collider 2D. You could even use use the get screen point to world point coordinate. Use 0, 0, 0. Great trick to find, at this position on the screen, what is the world coordinate for that? Enemy randomly changes direction between edges of the screen, so you can use some either random value less than or equal to something, or use invoke creatively. Enemy can speed up motion, apple dropping over the course of play. Player, in general, starts off with 3 baskets to catch items. One recommendation: take advantage of this to demonstrate your mastery of the array. Player basket movement is controlled by the mouse. Optional and horizontal axis. So if you wanted to use the get input, so that you could use a joystick or something like that, right? So either just use the mouse or use the horizontal axis and the mouse, or one or the other. That's fun for bonus. If the player catches an item, or the appropriate item now, if you want to have deadly items, you can do that too. If a player catches an item, score should increase. If the player misses an item, player loses a basket, and all of the dropped items that are in midair get destroyed. The game ends when all 3 baskets are lost. Use player prefs to save and load high score. Have a start scene and a game over scene. Use your lobby to allow the player to choose which game to launch, right? So remember the lobby, we had the main menu for starters. There was supposed to be a adventure, apple picker, shoot 'em up, and platformer game. So we want to start using that lobby scene specifically because, let's see, what's the last part here? This is more sort of juiciness here. We'll leave that. What we want to have happen is we want to start using itch.io. And some of you used itch. One person used play.unity, which I don't know an awful lot about. I haven't actually played with that one much. I've been kind of pointing people at itch for the longest time now. But I should have done some more my own homework back on that one. But I like to go through the itch process because it also brings in using WebGL and how that sort of works, and the whole potential for little community involvement. So itch.io is a site, oops, not itch.io. Itch.io. You'll find lots of cool games from lots of different indie developers using lots of different engines, lots of different approaches, and so on. And with an account, a free account, you can set up and kind of distribute your games. You can, get asked for money for them. You can have create a shareware, contributionware sorts of things. For now, assume these are all just game prototypes, and you're probably just going to set them up for public access. So, for example, I have, let's see, on my dashboard, I've got a bunch of variations on my games, usually for demonstrations like the Scarecrow version, platformer, fully physics, the Lego Apple Picker, Bird Boom, Asteroids, and so on. I think this is the one. I include, hopefully, I'm going to make a liar out of myself. There we go. The lobby screen, right? So there should be some way to say, all right, we can see all the games in here ultimately, so there's like one place to go. A student actually came to me kind of fairly recently and said, do you happen to have, a version of a game I developed in the class or whatever so I can put it in my portfolio to show somebody else? I'm like, I don't, maybe, turned out I did, but it's only because I'm a pack rat and haven't had to clear out space in my hard drive yet. But this is a good spot to just keep things as well and have it so if someone asks you, hey, I'm looking for collaborators, you can always point to something like this in the projects and refer back to them and so on. So, for example, here, I can go to Knuckles Escape, and we can see that version of the game here. And there is a pause and return to main menu sort of thing. So, itch.io, we want to kind of publish things there. It's worth points to publish your stuff on itch.io. And in order to do that, you can publish the game as a downloadable, full-on Unity project. And if you're doing something really advanced using the high-definition render pipeline or some kind of really advanced graphics things, you wouldn't just use WebGL. WebGL is fine for basic stuff. It's a decent 3D engine. It's based on OpenGL. It's very, very capable. Lots of great things can be built in WebGL, but it's really convenient that you can just go right to a web browser, and as long as it's WebGL compatible, it will just run. It's really, really nice. Doesn't always run on devices like the iPad, though. Mobile devices, maybe not so much. In theory, it probably should, but I think that's probably Apple just being difficult. But anyway, so to create a game for itch, it's sort of a simple process of choosing a new project, and once you have an account, you will be able to get to this. You'll have a name of the project. You'll notice it'll wind up giving you a URL. You can fill in all sorts of great things about them. You don't really need to do a lot of these things. Set pricing, and then ultimately upload files. That we want to do the WebGL version, not a downloadable version, because those tend to be larger and they're for a specific platform like Windows or something. So the big question, of course, is what is it that you upload here, right? So to create a WebGL application that you can upload here, you go to Unity, and I'll go to our newer one here. So here's our primitive version. And we'll go to File, Build Settings, and hopefully when you installed WebGL. So if you click on WebGL, you should have the option. You'll see some of these I can't switch to that platform, right? But WebGL, I can switch to that platform, right? So you always have a kind of the current platform that you're already set up to be building on, right? So by default here, I happen to be set up for building on Windows, but instead I want to go to WebGL, say switch platform, and at this point after it goes through and does some pre-configurations and setup, it will eventually Come on, Unity. Allow me to do a build or a build and run. Almost there. This is one of the main reasons you want to keep your project relatively lean. It's only going to pull in stuff that the project really needs. Ultimately, when you're building, it's only going to pull in the stuff the project needs that is actually referenced by the scenes that you tell it are in your project. So there's no harm in having lots of extra stuff in your project, but be careful not to have a lot of extra stuff lying around in your scenes. Come on, Unity. At this point, though, it's going through everything just in case. All right. And there's just a few things to watch out for. It's actually relatively painless once you get it set up. But there are a couple of things to worry about. One being, I don't want to explain it and then show it. That's take the. Any questions about the project, other than the HIO part? When going through the presentation stuff makes sense. All right. Yeah.
So because I really want to have like not be stored on class upload, where like if I have like a menu for the game and the game itself, how do I destroy when I like do want it to be destroyed? Like if I go all the way up to like the outer menu where you choose the game, right? And I like want to stop that.
So you want the music to stop at that point?
Yeah.
You certainly can explicitly destroy an object. So you'd have to sort of keep track of the object that you didn't destroy, and then say, have set a method for it to specifically clear that out and destroy it. So you can reinitialize your singleton by specifically having a method for destroying it. One way to do it. Almost bought ourselves enough time to. I forgot. I got to remember to start bringing my video game trivia cards. That'd be perfect for filling in filling time like this. We're almost done. 50% of one sprite. Interesting that it goes by thirds and then half. I see 33%, 50%. 68%. Okay, so it did a 33, 50. Oh. Definitely certain granularity to it. Random observation. Whew. So you don't want to change platforms all that often, obviously. It slows you down. All right, come on. All right. So other important things now. Now that we're set, we have the platform set. You'll see I've included here what scenes I want to include. Adventure, main menu, apple tree, platformer, shoot 'em up. So everything that's referenced from main menu on down, they have to be set here. Otherwise, your build won't have it in there. You're going to get errors like, oh, I can't load that scene. You may have already seen, come across that if you've tried to use the scene manager and you didn't include something specifically in your project. In the build settings, it might have said, oh, scene not found. Did you include it in your build settings? And you need to go back up here and do that. The other thing that people run into is that there's one setting specifically, and we go into player settings at the bottom of that scene, of that screen there. And if you scroll down in player settings, you will find Where are we here? Publishing settings. Yeah. Publishing settings, compression format. So you'll see it says, and here in my case, it said Brotli compression, which this Brotli, I don't know how to pronounce it. That type of compression, itch.io does not appreciate that. It does not, if you've ever like launched and suddenly just froze on there and you're like, why didn't I? It's probably because of that. You want to set that to gzip, and then it will work just fine. That's part of the problem, or the problem when that sort of thing happens. So after you set that, then you can close this again. Oh, if you want, you can set your company name, that sort of thing, product name, and so on. I wouldn't worry about cursors and icons and so on. That can get kind of weird and cause your mouse to disappear in the game. So do set a default company. Something like that. And then you would just say build. Find a folder. I usually set up a separate folder, like my WebGL builds. Name. So I would do like, set up a new folder here for test build. And tell it to go ahead and build in that directory. Because there's another step. We're not quite done yet. So it's going to go through the real building now, really deciding what's in the game based on what scenes are in there. So it's not going to include all of the assets. It's only going to include the things that are really part of the project now. So in this case, it should happen pretty quick because there's really not much in those scenes. Intermediate language to C++. So this is kind of the one of the key phases. I don't know how many of you have taken complang yet or compiler design. Got a lot of interesting, fun stuff going on in there. We're actually converting from all the intermediate stuff that Unity keeps track of. That's why every time you see compiling scripts and so on, it uses intermediate language inside. And ultimately, when it starts publishing, then it's either going to do internally, winds up actually converting to C++ and then compiling it for normal builds using that same IL2 CPP piece of things when it comes to actually optimizing for the platform that you're building for. So that's why you see building native binary with IL2 CPP. So it is no longer just interpreted at that point. Just. And usually it's pretty quick. Let's see if it's faster than, last one was what, about 4 minutes? See if it gets done in 2. All right. Once it does get done, though, the next step is that you would go to the directory that you created. So, for example, test build, where it's still working. And normally you'll take the contents of that directory, all the things in there, and you wouldn't see test.zip and WinRAR test. You'll see build, template data, index. I think that's what it have for the most part. Let's see here. Find a better one. Yeah, build, template data, and index. And you zip those up, everything that's in there, you zip that up into yet another normal zip file. And that is the zipped folder that you wind up uploading to itch, right? So it knows about that. It knows how to pull that apart, how to use the index file there, how to turn it back into playable goodness. And usually that's how all that's involved. It's not nearly as waiting for it is the most tedious part. And the important things to consider: make sure you set the compression right to not be bloatly, and also deciding when you do put it on itch, is it password protected? Is it a development build? Is lots of different things you can kind of tell it. Yeah.
So if we just publish like one entire project and it's the like list of the the main menu for the all the different games.
Yep.
Does that count? Like we just update it for a project, we just submit that one to
If you only do that at the very end, it counts as one, point-wise. If you do that consistently throughout, as I go to like grade each project, you'll get a point for each time, right? So you get, by adopting that early on, you'll get potentially 2 more points than you would have if just published it as the last one, right? So it's for going through the hassle of actually doing it that earn the points. Yeah. Wow. Today's just a slow day. So let's see. We do this. If we want, we can come back and no. So let's go and look in the syllabus where we have those feature points and talk about what that is. So some people have been getting ahead on the feature points, which is great. Usually at this point, from like the first projects, we don't have a lot of people who already used arrays or lists and things, but some of you have decided to sort of flex and show off on the first project, which is cool. Anything basically, 15 points is okay on the first project. Above 15 points, you're doing fine. So it's kind of typically what I expect to see people, getting the 8, 9, 10 for the overall project points, and then somewhere in at least 5 to 10 feature points for the first project. So this time, let's see what we got here. So you can imagine lots of room for points here. Publishing on itch, including animations, potentially even using the input system. Normal use of the mouse doesn't count as the input system on there, right? Input would be more like input get access and so on. Uh-oh. And let's see, instantiating prefabs, a good one in here. Lists, arrays, load scene, if you haven't already used load scene. Player prefs, here would be a good chance for that. Colliders, triggers, potentially one or the other or both. Reusing a script, potentially, if you do get advanced and start using multiple different types of dropped items, for example. Maybe you start to use scripts across different types of prefabs. Using time delta time to keep things consistent with regards to motion speed. Safe spawning is more enemies than we have an environment, so we won't be in there just yet. Gizmos, we're not there yet. Scoring system, we'll allow for multiples of that. Most people already enforced boundaries, had dynamic volume, UI text, and so on. Scored all those. So yeah, it's going to be, the first uses potentially of colliders and triggers and player preferences and lists and arrays, those sort of things earlier on in here. So we'll see a lot of that. And singletons, some people already use singletons even, so that's a good use for that. And here, so we'll see where it goes. So I don't know, I haven't worked out like what the average score on the next one is going to be. Some things, for those who haven't figured out, so the M's are supposed to be allowed the multiple use of, you can earn points on that more than once, right? So if you use coroutines, it's once per project though, right? So if you use 2 coroutines twice in the same project, you don't get it twice. But if you have a scoring system, good scoring system in all of your projects, you'll get that. Instantiating prefabs, you can get that multiple times across multiple projects. Effectors, if you wind up using those in, I don't know why I have that. That one should have M as well. Effectors and joints, mostly going to be in projects 3 and 4, and coroutines and itch.io publishing. Tags, that'll show up potentially in here. Layers, potentially, possibly. If you did interpolate any motion, you have it slow down, speed up, so on, possibly. So we'll see what the averages wind up there. Let's see, did it finish? Looks like it finished. All right. So yeah, I would just zip those up. And use whatever zip tool you have, but tell it zip format. And that's the file that you upload. I recommend at this point, don't password protect your itch page. Just let everybody see it if you want. It's nice to share. Sharing is caring. So down at the bottom here, you can do things like restrict them and so on. I typically just go ahead and let people see it. Some of these wind up being not exactly what they say. Only those who can edit the project can view the page. Only owners and authorized people can view the page, which I think is the password protected or potentially password protected. So only people who own the project can view it. You can give access by generating a download key. Or, let's see. No, don't want to do that. Whoops, what happened here? Oh, enable this after you've saved. So I guess they want to make sure that you've actually uploaded and everything's good, and then you can publish it. So that's that. I'm not going to actually publish that last one. If there are no other questions, we'll end on the early side. You all know what you're in for. Next week, like I said, we're not going to be meeting normal next week. So if you have any questions, go ahead and ask them on Discord, and I will try to get to them as quickly as possible. I'm usually pretty responsive on Discord. I'll just kind of be checking in a couple of last things with regards to the last project, but I think we're in good shape. There's nobody that I'm really worried about at this point, with one person who just never showed up for a class at all, so that's kind of the extreme case. But I think we're in good shape. Sound good? All right. If there are no questions, we can stop there for the day, and I'll see you in a week and a couple of days in person. And let me just stop recording.